When it comes to the art of diplomacy, there's a number of ways countries talk to each other. There's economic diplomacy. For example, I give you money and you give me oil. You know what I mean. Cultural diplomacy. I give you Louis Armstrong playing jazz at the pyramids and you let me move this oil through your canal. And then there's this.
Another lethal blow against suspected drug traffickers.
The U.S. striking another alleged drug vessel in the waters off Venezuela.
Gunboat diplomacy. Give me your oil or else.
Venezuela was ready to collapse. We would have taken it over. We would have gotten all that oil.
This is how the U.S. has dealt with Venezuela for decades. But Donald Trump has turned that dial way up. It started with missile strikes on speedboats, then an aircraft carrier moved into the Caribbean. US troops deployed in Panama, and CIA operatives were sent to Caracas. President Trump says it's a war on drugs. That Venezuelan leader, Nicolas Maduro, is a so-called narco-terrorist who's flooding the US with cocaine, mass violence, and sex trafficking. But it's starting to look like a war on Venezuela.
Millones de campesinos y campesinas estén preparados para tomar las armas y defender la República Bolivariana de Venezuela.
So is this really about narcotics?
Venezuela's not involved in the drug trade because the UN says they're not involved in the drug. I don't care what the UN says. The UN doesn't know what they're talking about.
Is it even about Venezuela or something else, like China and its growing influence in Latin America?
Maduro offered us a dominant stake in Venezuela's oil, gold, and mineral wealth, and promised to cut ties with Russia and China.
So how far is Trump willing to go? And will China back down? I'm Mohammed Hassan, and this is Pinch Point, where politics and geography collide. Let's play a game. Can you guess who does the most trade with these countries in Latin America? The US or China? Let's start with Brazil. Answer: China. What about Mexico? Answer: the US. Chile, China. Peru, China. Argentina, China. As you go across the region, it's clear that China has been making big moves. In the last few years, China's become South America's biggest trade partner, usurping a role the US has fought to maintain for more than 200 years. And it's always been very protective of that role. All the way back in 1823, US President James Monroe issued the Monroe Doctrine, a warning to European powers to abandon their colonial pursuits in the Western Hemisphere. Then in 1904, President Theodore Roosevelt amended that doctrine, giving the United States power to intervene militarily in Latin American countries. The Roosevelt corollary kick-started America's view of itself as world police, and over the next century began to flex its growing military power. In the 20th century alone, it sent its armed forces to Peru, Nicaragua, Mexico, Honduras, Guatemala. It occupied parts of Haiti, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Panama, Colombia, and it helped overthrow governments in Argentina, Chile, El Salvador, Bolivia, Brazil. Honestly, it's easier to name a country that wasn't shaped by US intervention. Maybe Costa Rica. Whenever a country got too cozy with a rival, Team USA stepped in to protect its interests, which throughout the 20th century can be summed up in one word: oil. And sitting at the top of this region is a country with more proven oil reserves than anywhere else in the world: Venezuela. Back in the day, the two countries were pretty friendly, and US companies had unchallenged access to Venezuelan oil fields. But that all changed in 1999, when a revolutionary socialist government led by Hugo Chavez seized power. Fiercely anti-American, Chavez focused on building closer ties with Iran, Russia, and China, and keeping Venezuelan oil firmly under state control. Here's how he described US President George W. Bush in 2006 following his invasion of Iraq.
Para decírtelo en mi mal inglés, en mi bad English, you are a donkey, Mr. Danger. You are a donkey, Mr. Bush. Si algún día se te va a ocurrir la locura de invadir Venezuela, te espero en esta sabana, Mr. Danger. Come on here, Mr. Danger.
So yeah, not a fan. The root of this tension came from Chavez's belief that the US had tried everything they could to topple him, starting with an attempted coup in 2002 where he was detained for 48 hours, to an alleged assassination attempt in 2005, to his accusation that US aid was funding opposition parties. When Chavez died and his deputy, Nicolas Maduro, took over in 2013, the US placed heavy sanctions on Venezuela, labeling it as a threat to national security. It said that Chavez and Maduro secretly fronted an international cartel cartel called Cartel de los Soles and used the army to facilitate drug trafficking to keep themselves in power. But does this cartel even exist? There's not much evidence to prove it. According to UN data, most of the drugs that are flowing through Venezuela don't end up in the US and mostly goes to Europe. For example, if you look at where cocaine is produced and transported into the US, it's being made in Colombia and Peru and transported through Mexico. In other words, it's the US's allies who are most responsible for its drug problems. Here's the thing though, throughout this whole ordeal, Venezuela never stopped selling oil to the US. Why?
Because of the strong economic ties between Venezuela and the United States, including the refineries in the Gulf Coast of the United States that were dependent on receiving Venezuelan crude, which is a very specific type of crude, and their refineries were designed to process that very specific type of Venezuelan crude.
Whenever it needed access to crude, the US quietly gave licenses to American companies like Chevron, allowing them to bypass sanctions. Until 2023, the US was buying half of all Venezuela's oil exports. But Venezuela was also looking elsewhere for trade. And this is where China comes in. Back in 2001, China needed large amounts of crude oil to fuel its modernization project, and Hugo Chavez needed a buyer who wasn't threatening to impose sanctions. That year, Venezuela became the first Hispanic country to sign a major trade deal with China. A year later, the US tried to overthrow Chavez in a coup, and like I said, failed. The US increasingly saw Venezuela as part of a so-called troika of tyranny with Cuba and Nicaragua, socialist governments with strong ties to China and Russia, and therefore threats to its interests in the region. But the more the US tried to isolate Venezuela, the more China stepped in to fill the gap. It gave Venezuela more than $60 billion in state loans for housing projects and helped it build railways and ports. Its cargo ships figured out how to bypass US sanctions too, by turning their transponders off in Venezuelan waters. For Venezuela, crippled by corruption and a currency in freefall, China became a lifeline. For China, Venezuela became its entry point into Latin America and a key transport hub for its Belt and Road Initiative. Since then, China began to expand its influence really quickly. In Panama, it built bridges, high-speed rail, and ports along the Panama Canal. It's investing heavily in the so-called Lithium Triangle, Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile, countries rich in the mineral vital for China's growing electric car industry. More than 20 Latin American countries have signed up for the Belt and Road Initiative, most recently Colombia. In 2024, China signed free trade deals with Chile, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Nicaragua, and Peru, and in May 2025 hosted regional leaders in Beijing, announcing a $9 billion investment line of credit. But by far, its biggest partnership in the region has been with Brazil, a key member of the BRICS economic alliance of 10 countries. The expanding economic partnership wants a new currency for international trade, much to the horror of the US. And while Brazil has downplayed this in recent months, it's made it clear it doesn't want to be, quote, fully dependent on the dollar.
You wouldn't have the dollar as your currency anymore. You wouldn't have a world domination by the dollar if I didn't win this election. BRICS was an attack on the dollar.
When Donald Trump first took office in 2016, he had China in his scopes, accusing it of taking advantage of US weakness on the world stage and promoting the spread of drugs past its borders. He then hiked sanctions on Venezuela and fostered ties with right-wing leaders in Brazil, Argentina, and El Salvador. When Joe Biden replaced him in 2020, containing China's rapid growth was high on his agenda. But despite his attempts at limiting its access to vital minerals and semiconductors, the regional shift was only going in one direction. Probably the most telling moment was in November 2024, during the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum in Peru. President Joe Biden had gone to reassert the close ties between neighbors in the Americas, but during the forum, China inaugurated a $3.5 billion deepwater megaport just outside the capital, Lima. During a group photo to conclude the summit, China's Xi Jinping was placed front and center, right next to Peru's president. And Biden was, well, all the way back here. Ouch. By the time Trump returned to office in 2025, he was convinced something more drastic had to be done. His Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, had long advocated for a more hawkish approach in Latin America and believed the spread of China and its socialist influences was the primary threat to US interests.
The Communist Party of China leads PRC, is the most potent and dangerous near-peer adversary this nation has ever confronted. They have elements that the Soviet Union never possessed. They are a technological adversary and competitor, an industrial competitor, an economic competitor, a geopolitical competitor, a scientific competitor now, in every realm. The Chinese believe that the United States are a great power in inevitable decline and that they are an inevitable rise.
Rubio began his tenure with a long tour of the region, the first time a U.S. Secretary of State had done this since 1912, making it clear that Trump's America First policy was also an America's First policy, and that he expected his neighbors to reciprocate. Their first target was Panama.
And above all, China is operating the Panama Canal, and we didn't give it to China, we gave it to Panama, and we're taking it back.
Panama's government hit back, saying its canal wasn't up for grabs, and that it wanted no part in the US-China rivalry. But just 2 weeks later, it was forced to drop out of the Belt and Road Initiative and allow US investment company BlackRock to acquire the Panama Ports Company, which China is now trying to block with its own bid. Then in April, the US deployed troops near the canal for military training exercises, and the message couldn't be more obvious.
China did not build this canal. China does not operate this canal. And China will not weaponize this canal.
In July, the US slapped a 40% tariff on Brazilian goods in response to the jailing of the country's former president, Jair Bolsonaro, a Trump ally and a vocal critic of China. In September, Rubio placed visa restrictions on Central American nationals accused of acting on behalf of the Chinese government, which he said was a corrupt influence on the region. And then there's Argentina. President Javier Milei had publicly rejected an offer to join BRICS in 2023, vying for closer ties to the US. But facing an economic crisis and spiraling inflation, he accepted a $5 billion currency swap with Beijing in April 2025. By October, the US stepped in, offering Argentina a $20 billion loan, but only if Milei remained in power. Days later, Milei won a landslide election victory.
Argentina, I want to congratulate the victor, and he was a big victor, and he had a lot of help from us.
By now, the US Navy had become a dominant presence in the Caribbean, escalating attacks on boats alleged to be transporting drugs from Venezuela. International drug cartels were designated as terror organizations, and a $50 million bounty was placed on Nicolas Maduro's head.
CIA have authority to take out Maduro?
Oh, I don't want to answer a question like that. That's a ridiculous question for me to be given. Not really a ridiculous question, but wouldn't it be a ridiculous question for me to answer? But I think Venezuela is feeling heat, but I think a lot of other countries are feeling heat too.
Now, here's what's interesting. In the background of this military escalation, Maduro tried to appease Trump, offering to open up all existing and future oil and gold projects to American companies and reverse the flow of Venezuelan oil exports from China. And initially, the US president considered the offer, but it was Marco Rubio that pushed him to reject it. Rubio firmly believed that the socialist leaders in the region relied on each other politically and economically, and that toppling Maduro would lead to the collapse of Nicaragua and Cuba. Instead, the US could get more favorable trade deals with a capitalist in charge, like Venezuela's opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado, who's currently in hiding.
Forget about the Saudis. I mean, we have more oil. I mean, infinite potential. And we're going to open markets. We're going to kick off the government from the oil sector. We are going to privatize all our industry. Venezuela has huge resources: oil, gas, minerals, land, technology.
On October 6, the US cut all diplomatic communication with Venezuela, seemingly ending any hope of de-escalating the situation. Maduro had little choice but to plead with Trump in public.
Donald Trump, usted tiene que cuidarse, porque Marco Rubio quiere manchar sus manos de sangre, con sangre suramericana, caribeña, con sangre venezolana. Lo quieren llevar a un baño de sangre y que su apellido, Trump, se manche de sangre por los siglos de los siglos.
Backed into a corner, Maduro turned to China and Russia for help. Internal US documents appear to show letters from Maduro to Xi Jinping, asking for expanded military cooperation and radar detection systems. But despite issuing strong statements condemning US military escalations, China seems reluctant to involve itself directly. Having already invested so much into the country, could it now decide to cut its losses?
China did not throw fresh money at Venezuela, right? They were already had loaned Venezuela quite a bit, and Venezuela was already struggling to pay back their loans, and Venezuela has defaulted on most of their debt. But Venezuela did start making oil payments to China to service some of that debt.
Even if Trump succeeds with his military aims, it could have lasting repercussions. Trump's MAGA base elected him on an anti-war platform and held him back from escalating a military confrontation with Iran in June. And while Trump made a public display of deporting Venezuelan migrants, the collapse of the government could lead to an unprecedented new wave of migration towards the US border. But most starkly, what this apparent march to war has done is put the whole of Latin America on edge.
It does raise questions. Is the administration planning to take these kinds of actions in other countries where there are foreign terrorist organizations that are involved in drug trafficking? And that includes some of our closest partners in the region, and what the economic and political fallout of that could be. If the US government is going to partners in Latin America and asking them to cut back on the relationship with China, one of the big questions is going to be, well, what is the US government bringing to the table?
As China considers how to protect its interests in the region while avoiding a direct confrontation with its rival, it could decide that its best strategy is to sit back and hope the US is making a terrible mistake.